Guys, fair warning. Every third video game console you release is gonna be a failure. Be careful out there. This is an interesting little thing that's just happened throughout video game history, and there's no telling why, but I mean, we can kind of take a look back at every single situation. But pretty much all of the big console manufacturers, they experience a lot of great success with many of their consoles, but for some reason, every 3 consoles they release, that's a console that's kind of plagued by a bunch of little problems. I wouldn't say any of these third consoles are inherently massive flops. Some of them may have been, some of them may have had trouble selling for a bit, and then some of them may have turned out okay in the end. But overall, every third console, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, hell, even Sega released, kind of had some massive problems. So let's start with Nintendo here. First console is the NES, second console is the Super Nintendo, and third console is the N64. And the N64 actually kind of broke Nintendo's winning streak there. NES and SNES won their respective generations. N64? Yes, a lot to decipher from this metric. The Nintendo 64 did okay, all things considered. Plenty of consoles did far worse than the N64, but it was definitely pretty jarring to go from NES and SNES, where Nintendo was the king of video games, to literally an unprecedented number of consoles sold with the PS1 compared to 32 million units sold with the N64. So what hurt the N64 that badly? Well, you can kind of point to a couple of bad decisions Nintendo made with this thing. Firstly, this thing came out like 2 years after the PS1 did, and there were a fair amount of delays associated with the N64. They kept hyping this thing up in Nintendo Power magazine, and it just wouldn't come out for years. They had to keep on putting out stuff on the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy. Hell, Nintendo rushed the Virtual Boy out to market just to put something out on store shelves in 1995. This thing took forever to release, but when it finally did, it launched alongside one of the greatest, most innovative games of all time, and Mario 64. But okay, that's great. What's next? It's a big problem. N64 had like a ton of software droughts. Like, not a lot of games were coming out for it consistently. And at the end of it all, the N64 only had about 300 or so games released for it, which, it's a good chunk of games when you compare that to the amount of games on PS1. Eep. And this lack of software was primarily because the N64 chose cartridges as its main format. Now, why did Nintendo choose cartridges? Well, the loading times were faster, but primarily I think Nintendo's biggest thing they really liked about cartridges was that they were harder to pirate. CD format is famously easy to crack, especially on like something like a Sega Dreamcast. You can just burn games onto a standard CDR and boom, you're golden. But N64 cartridges were entirely proprietary, and you had the extra bonus of like, hey, not a lot of loading times. But obviously Nintendo knew the benefits of using CDs for video games at the time. They were planning on doing the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, the SNES CD. They were planning on working on that with Sony, and that eventually turned into the PlayStation. No, they decided to go the way of cartridges on the N64, and I think this right here just spelled disaster all over the N64. This was a problem Nintendo was dealing with till the day the N64 died. And I think they went with them because of arrogance. Nintendo didn't think anybody would leave them. I think they thought, hey, we're Nintendo. We're the kings of video games. Everybody's gonna want to make games for the N64. So it doesn't matter if the cartridges cost more to produce and you can't fit as much onto these things. We're Nintendo and everybody fucking loves us. Oh wow, where did everybody go? All over to Sony and even Sega with the Sega Saturn. The PlayStation 1 was the console this generation. It had the most games, and pretty much all the third-party companies that made legendary games on the Super Nintendo, pretty much all the sequels to those games were on PlayStation. If you were a Mega Man fan on Super Nintendo, you needed to get a PlayStation. If you were a fan of Castlevania, you needed to get a PlayStation. If you were a Final Fantasy fan, holy shit, you needed a PlayStation. And that's not even mentioning all the legendary series that started on the PS1. You have Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, even though Metal Gear was a thing before the PS1, but it's, the PS1 was where it really started gaining traction, especially here in North America. Tomb Raider, and then you also had all of the PlayStation exclusive Sony published games, stuff like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Gran Turismo, that was massive. You had Parappa the Rapper, Twisted Metal, and then you had all these games on PlayStation just running better than they did on N64. N64 definitely had some strengths compared to PS1, but for the most part, I find that a lot of the multi-platform games on both consoles, the PS1 version oftentimes felt less like muddy. You often had full motion video cutscenes, better music, more content. Now the N64 did get some massive third-party games, stuff like Resident Evil 2, but this is often kind of seen as like a miracle port, something where it's just like, wow, they fit this thing on such a small cartridge, this game that needed like 2 CDs on the PS1. And yeah, this is cool. This is a solid version of Resident Evil 2. But it's more of a novelty these days. It's kind of just cool to look back at if you know enough about why the N64 was annoying for these developers to port games to, because they could barely fit any of their damn games on these cartridges. Now, this isn't to say the N64 is a bad console, far from it. Genuinely, some of the most legendary games of all time occurred on this console. And just the fact that the N64 came with 4 controller ports right out of the box, I think was massive. I mean, it just made the N64 stand out that much more. And to this day, the N64 still kind of considered one of the legendary kings of local multiplayer. Like, some of the best multiplayer games of all time were on the N64, or at least, like, you know, the most legendary. Stuff like Mario Kart 64, Mario Party, GoldenEye. I think what I love the most about the N64 is the genuine feel when you jump into one of its best titles. Something like popping in Mario 64 on the cartridge, just popping that in an N64, sitting down, playing with an N64 controller. There's just such a cozy feeling to that. And it's really hard to explain, but the N64 is such a cozy console when it comes to, like, let's say 30 of its best games. I don't think the N64 library is bad, and a lot of these complaints I can also make about the PlayStation 1. It's just kind of the era of gaming at the time. This is kind of the awkward teenage years of 3D gaming, because really, I mean, this was the first generation where 3D games were a standard. So a lot of developers were still getting their feet wet, so you have a lot of games that are fully in 3D, but they just feel awkward. And I don't think it's until the next generation with the GameCube, PS2, etc., where, you know, things start to feel a lot more refined and much more, I don't know, playable. So I'd say the vast majority of the N64 library is just kind of like whatever. You got a good handful of bad games, but for the most part, it's just a lot of like kind of mediocre, just whatever titles. But I'd say the N64 has like 30-something games or so that are just, bar none, amazing titles. They may not age well today, but like you cannot deny their legacy and just how important they were. And of course, you know, I am kind of in a little Nintendo bubble because I'm a little Nintendo gremlin, just piece of shit. But I often see more people talking about the N64 and just reminiscing about that compared to the PS1. And of course, a lot of that is kind of just because I think Nintendo fans are more likely to do that. And also because I think as well as the PS1 did, the fact that it appealed to way more people kind of means that even though it sold like super well, I think you put 2 PS1 owners together in a room and they probably don't have a ton in common. One guy might have been just all about sports games and one guy might have been all about RPGs. You put 2 N64 owners in a room, they're all gonna like whatever, like just high five and fucking make out with each other over like whatever, Mario Party 3. Because if you own a Nintendo console, you probably owned it for Nintendo games. You own a Sony console, I mean, the exclusives on PlayStation are fantastic, but I think a lot more people buy PlayStation consoles for a ton of third-party games as well. So I think that's kind of why I see a lot of talk about the N64, even though it did not sell nearly as well as the PS1. But you know what? Nintendo learned their lesson with the N64. Not really. Because then we have the GameCube, which was fundamentally kind of just Nintendo taking the N64 and just making it more advanced in every way. You know, unlike a lot of Nintendo consoles, you know, like from the Nintendo DS onward, the GameCube didn't really have like a massive gimmick. It was kind of just like, yeah, we're gonna do another console and it's gonna be more powerful. And similarly to the N64, you see a lot of people have wonderful memories of the GameCube, myself included. And yeah, I think there's a lot of GameCube talk around, mainly because like, yeah, it's similar to the N64. You put 2 GameCube owners in a room and they're basically gonna start fucking each other. It's like, oh yeah, I played Pikmin 2 as well. And then, you know, you put 2 PS2 owners in a room and like, you know, one owned Fantavision and one owned ESPN NBA basketball. Like, it's just like, What do you want them to talk about with each other? But the GameCube did even worse than the N64, and, you know, I think it was just because they did not really learn anything from the N64 debacle. It's like when they heard that, like, hey, people want discs, they were like, okay, here's discs. Use mini DVDs, man. Not even actual mini DVDs. These are proprietary Nintendo discs. The PS2 and Xbox were using DVDs, which could store a lot more data, and these could basically store like half the amount of data as a PS2 game. So we were basically in the exact same fucking problem that we had with the N64. Now, GameCube didn't get a lot of the third-party games that it needed because they chose a stupid-ass format for their games. But that all started with the N64, their third console. You know, eventually Nintendo kind of got things back on track with the Wii in 2006, their fifth console. And of course, with Nintendo's sixth console, so their second, third. Oh my lord, I cannot escape this thing, can I? Yeah, the Wii U is the second, third console, so of course it failed. Nintendo's biggest flop in terms of their mainline home consoles. You know, I mean, you can take a look at stuff like Virtual Boy or the Game Boy Micro or whatever. And yeah, those did worse, but in terms of like their dedicated mainline home consoles, the Wii U did absolutely the worst. Now, why was that? What did Nintendo do wrong with this? What did they do right? Listen, man, the Wii U just had problem after problem after problem. Firstly, obviously, the name. I think it makes sense that this console is a Wii console. You know, I think it needed to be Wii something. But Nintendo had to be cutesy about it, name it Wii U instead of just something basic like Wii 2. Many people assumed this was just a controller add-on. I mean, THQ released the U-Draw game tablet for the Wii. And it is a tablet with this giant touch-sensitive area that you use a stylus with, that you put a Wii remote in, and, you know, multiple Wii games support it. When this kind of stuff was releasing for the Wii, yeah, the Wii U just kind of seemed like it was just an accessory. And I don't think it helped that Nintendo obviously didn't really have a core idea for what this controller could do. I remember back with the Wii's initial reveal, you know, when they first revealed the Nintendo Revolution's innovative new controller. And it felt like Nintendo had a billion uses for the Wii remote, and it just kind of got your brain cooking as to like, oh my god, think about the possibilities with this thing. And they did a similar thing with the Wii U gamepad, but it felt like even with their initial reveal trailer that like they were really stretching with this. It's just the Wii U gamepad felt very uninspired. It just kind of felt like, hey, let's put a screen on the controller and surely some ideas will come from that. And not a ton really ever did. I'm not gonna act like there's never been good uses for this controller. I mean, hey, I've had tons of really fun experiences on the Wii U that really did utilize this controller's screen. But for the most part, I would say a good 80 to 90% throughout the entire Wii U library felt very forced, uninspired, or was just flat out bad. And third-party devs gave this console a good year and a half or so of a try, you know. 2013 was kind of like the last major year we really saw any major third-party games. And then in 2014, there was nothing other than Watch Dogs because Ubisoft promised that it would come out on Wii U. And after that, from 2015 onward, the Wii U basically got like no substantial third-party support. Like it got Just Dance games, the Skylanders games, the Lego games. You got a couple of like indie releases, Darksiders War Mastered Edition in like 2017. I don't know, man. But then it comes down to the Nintendo games themselves. And Nintendo had a fair amount of very solid games on the Wii U. A couple of more mediocre ones and some outright horrible games, but you know, the good games on Wii U were really damn good. But even with a ton of really good exclusives, I think the problem is the Wii U just didn't really have like a ton of like, wow, you got to drop everything and spend $300 on this game right here. And I would even say by the time the Wii U started to get like very unique experiences that I think could have been system sellers, the problem is they just released too late. I would say the two big Wii U games that I think were system sellers were Splatoon and Super Mario Maker. And those released in 2015. By that point, the Wii U, it was already dead. By March of 2015, Nintendo already announced they had plans to make a brand new console, the Nintendo NX. For years, kind of the notion with a lot of consoles that aren't doing very well is that you need good games. Without good games, your console isn't gonna sell. And the Wii U is an example of, yeah, it had really good games and it still didn't sell. And that's because the console itself was so clunky, was so annoying, was so unappealing that nobody wanted it. It didn't matter. You could put the greatest fucking game of all time on this thing. And they did. The last Nintendo published game on this thing was Breath of the Wild, one of the greatest games of all time. And nobody gave a fuck about it on the Wii U. They wanted it on the Nintendo Switch. I think the Wii U's biggest problem was that it was directionless. They wanted to do a gimmicky controller again because they saw that was successful with the Wii, and they just kind of made this without really thinking much about it. They didn't really think it through enough. All right, done with this clown. Now let's talk about I don't know, the town jester. Yep, Microsoft's third console was the Xbox One. You had the original Xbox in 2001, then the Xbox 360 in 2005, and then they wanted to be cute. And, yep, the Xbox One. Genuinely one of the stupidest goddamn names of all time. I'm sorry. You know, I think the Wii U's name was more confusing casually, just on the store shelves. It's kind of like, what the hell is that? I think the Xbox One is a little more confusing, like, retrospectively, because, you know, they weren't selling Xbox Ones, like the first Xboxes, on store shelves at the time. Just a dumb name, man. Especially they wanted to push this as the all-in-one ultimate entertainment center. Also, it doesn't play your Xbox 360 games. All right, so Microsoft was riding a bit of a high from the Xbox 360 era. Even though near the end of that era, Sony was definitely starting to gain a lot more market share. And, you know, the Xbox 360 actually ended up being the third best-selling console that generation. Near the beginning of the 360's life, Microsoft was really trying by, you know, pumping out just big-ass exclusives. You got the original Gears of War, and of course, you got Halo 3. And of course, throughout the generation, Microsoft also worked in tandem with Activision to kind of have Call of Duty call Xbox 360 its home. It's still released on PS3, but in all the marketing, Call of Duty was always on 360. And you had a lot of third-party exclusives, like BioShock was initially an exclusive for the 360. Same with Mass Effect 1. Microsoft actually got Grand Theft Auto 4 to come out day and date on the Xbox 360 right alongside the PS3. Well, Peter Moore at the time, he did like 2 little stunts to reveal like release dates and big news and stuff. He got a tattoo of Halo 2's release date on one arm, and then a tattoo of Grand Theft Auto 4's logo on the other. Now, I don't actually know if any of this is real. That GTA 4 tattoo looks a little painted on, but hey, I mean, he did it, apparently. I don't know. The point is, Microsoft was serious. They really wanted you to know, like, hey, we're serious, and you got to get an Xbox 360 and play all your games on there. But eventually, I think Microsoft wanted an even bigger piece of the pie. And in 2010, they started going after more of the casual market than Nintendo went after with the Wii. This is around the time that Microsoft started focusing more on just everybody, and also kind of like the core titles that were kind of just like surefire bets at that point. Every Microsoft E3 press conference was like the exact same. You got a gameplay look at the Call of Duty coming out that fall, and then you had a new Halo, a new Gears of War, and a new Forza. And that was basically all Xbox was from there on out. Of course, that and a bunch of Kinect casual garbage. Now, the Kinect for Xbox 360 had a ton of potential, and it was kind of fun in many instances, but overall, I think Microsoft overpromised and underdelivered with the Kinect. Was it a decent piece of technology? Yes. Was it a good video game controller? Not really. The tech was decent, but it wasn't good enough to really be like a substantial enough video game controller. And of course, Microsoft was also focusing big time on movies and TV with the Xbox 360. The 360 was turning into this big multimedia device. They introduced Internet Explorer for the 360. They started doing Xbox Smart Glass, where, oh man, and you get a second screen experience when you're watching all your shows. Netflix and all these other streaming services were a big push. And overall, while the 360 was still like a great platform and was honestly still like probably my preferred pick around that era, the PS3 was focusing solely on good ass games. The Xbox 360, by comparison, it had games, you know, like they were still pumping stuff out. And of course it got a ton of third-party support. It pretty much got all the third-party games you could want at the time. But it felt like the PS3 was far more passionate about actual video games in that moment. And it felt like Microsoft was more so coasting along, feeling cozy, like, hey, we're Xbox, man. We're awesome. People love us. This mentality with the Xbox brand bled into the Xbox One's reveal in May of 2013. And this is one of the most disastrous product reveals of all time. The Xbox One's reveal barely focused on video games whatsoever. In an hour-long press conference, the bulk of the Xbox One's reveal was all about just its menu interface and how it's so much more convenient to watch TV shows and movies this way. They showed off a brand new Kinect that was forcibly bundled with the Xbox One. Now, to an extent, I kind of get why Microsoft wanted to do this, because that way they don't have to worry about like, oh, which one of our Xbox One users has a Kinect and which ones don't. Like, no, it's just always in the box. However, the problem is a lot of stuff started coming out after this console reveal, which already wasn't popular, and all this was confirmed. The Kinect must be plugged in at all times. You have to be connected to the internet. You cannot play used games with the Xbox One. They ended up showing like FIFA and like Forza 5 and like Quantum Break, and then they started talking about like a Halo TV show with Steven Spielberg's involvement, and it's just kind of like, what does this have to, who cares? I think it's crazy, during this big console reveal, they're talking about a Steven Spielberg Halo TV show, and that thing didn't even come out until 2022. Like, this functionally had nothing to do with the Xbox One. It's crazy. This is one of the worst console reveals of all time, and it did immense damage to Microsoft and the Xbox brand. And I don't think Microsoft really ever recovered much from this. Now, thankfully, it was only a couple weeks later that E3 2013 happened. And I think a lot of people look back at E3 2013 and they go like, oh yeah, PlayStation absolutely creamed Xbox at that time. And while that is true, I think a lot of people don't really remember that like Microsoft's press conference, in my opinion, was actually pretty okay. You know, they started off with Metal Gear Solid 5 and they ended with Titanfall, which wowed everybody at the time. You had a teaser for the next Halo game, even though that teaser had literally like nothing to do with what Halo 5 ended up being. Like it was literally just like nonsense. It's like, oh, Master Chief is in a cloak. Dead Rising 3, Sunset Overdrive, the return of Killer Instinct, which turned out to be a great fighting game. There was a decent amount of good stuff at the E3 2013 Xbox One conference. The problem was, it was still the Xbox One, and the Xbox One put a big ass stink in everybody's mouth. There was just all this bad PR afterwards, where like Don Matrix said like, oh yeah, if the Xbox One isn't doing it for you and you don't like the online only things, we'll just buy an Xbox 360. And it's just like, well, that's just stupid. And then, of course, Sony's press conference at E3 2013, they pretty much immediately just started bludgeoning Microsoft to death at that point. Literally saying, hey, our console is $399 when Microsoft announced their console was $499 with the Kinect forcibly included, and they weren't going back on any of this nonsense that they were pushing. And that pretty much ensured the PS4 was winning that generation. It didn't even matter. Like, in my opinion, I think the PS4 had a far worse launch lineup than the Xbox One. You had Forza 5 at the Xbox One's launch, which is, you know, I mean, Forza is a great quality sim racing game. And then Dead Rising 3, which is actually pretty good. Like, Dead Rising 3 is not bad. And I think they actually did a good job showcasing the power of this generation with how many zombies were on screen. And then you had Rise Son of Rome, which was definitely a little more controversial. It's kind of like, okay, this is a really good looking game, but you know, it is kind of very cutscene heavy, you know, but overall, like, I think the Xbox One's launch was better than the PS4's with what? Knack and Killzone Shadowfall. And thankfully, a couple weeks after E3, it's pretty obvious Microsoft was kind of seeing like, okay, this isn't working out. The Xbox One could actually play used games. The Xbox One did not require a constant internet connection, and it was a big win for Microsoft. sort of. So much stuff we do these days is always online and requires all this garbage, and, you know, like Microsoft themselves, they've gone pretty much fully digital at this point. So in many ways, it does kind of feel like Microsoft was a bit ahead of the time with the Xbox One initially, even if it was in really dumb and lame ways. Like, they announced Crackdown 3, and Crackdown 3 was like really well wanted. Like, people were like, we want another Crackdown game. And they finally announced it, and they would say like, oh, we're gonna take advantage of the cloud. Then you can just destroy the entire environment, you know, that's gonna be crazy. And of course that game took like, what, like 5 years to come out, and no. My thing is, with Microsoft's initial vision for what the Xbox One could have been, yes, I don't think it was very good for the consumer at that time, but I'm interested to see like what they wanted to do with that moving forward, if it would have actually benefited some games. At the same time, I'm also kind of like, yeah, I hate always online crap. And always online stuff in 2013, yeah, a lot of people had the internet, but it's also like, it was 2013. The internet was not as good as it is nowadays. Like, I look back at how things were in 2013, and like, I'm seeing YouTube videos were only at like 720p, and I'm just like, wow, this looks way worse than I remember. So while I'm kind of interested to see like what they could have done with the initial plan with the Xbox One, I also feel like they actually wouldn't have done anything, and it was literally just a measure to stop piracy, stop used game sales, and try to make the most money possible. Now, since thankfully Microsoft walked back on all those things, everything's all fine and good, right? No! The Xbox One was a bit less powerful than the PS4. Now, in practice, most of the time, like if you're gonna play a third-party game on Xbox One, it was gonna be perfectly fine. Like, you know, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. But that was kind of a bit of a stinger when the Xbox One was $499. It was all because of that damn Kinect. And guess what? Barely any games even use the damn Kinect. They forced it in the package, and like barely anything actually used the Kinect. Like, there's only like 20 something games on the Xbox One in general that need or use the Kinect in any way. Now, here's the thing. Thankfully, I would say a lot of the problems with the Xbox One kind of peaked at that point. Because after that, Microsoft really tried to re-steer the ship. Eventually, they dropped the Kinect from the Xbox One bundle, and that dropped the price of this thing to $399, and they started to try to do a lot of good faith things here and there. Stuff like introducing Xbox 360 games as backwards compatible titles. And Microsoft introduced Xbox Game Pass, which ended up becoming the thing that Microsoft started pushing the most, and you know, to some extent, it could be considered, you know, what really is making Xbox even worse these days. But still, at the time, Xbox Game Pass was a great deal. But you know what I think was one of the biggest problems with the Xbox One that was never really solved? The game lineup. I just felt like Microsoft's exclusive games took a massive hit this generation, and just there wasn't really enough compelling stuff at all. And even a lot of the games that people really loved from the Xbox 360 or original Xbox, like, yeah, they were here, but they just didn't really hit the same. Halo was kind of stumbling around. You had Gears of War Ultimate Edition, Gears of War 4, Gears of War 5, and those are all, again, good quality games, but I just felt like the Gears series at this point was not really appealing to anybody other than Gears of War fans. Like, there just wasn't really a ton that Microsoft was pumping out that was really getting everybody's attention from all other corners. Like, it was just kind of like the same old stuff, or just a random exclusive that they did with a random company that just never really turned out that amazing. Something like ReCore. ReCore was kind of like this weird one-off exclusive game that they actually ended up doing like a definitive edition of later down the line to fix a lot of the problems with the original ReCore. Super Lucky's Tale was kind of a weird one. Okay, you get a little 3D platformer, but it was a pretty generic 3D platformer based on an old VR exclusive game. Now, one thing I think Microsoft did really well in this generation were the indie games, because I remember Inside was an Xbox One exclusive initially, and Cuphead was an Xbox One exclusive initially. And those are two massive gets, you know, that's great. Good for Microsoft. But overall, it's really hard to even look back and name a bunch of Xbox One exclusives. A lot of games that should have been big moments for this console ended up not turning out very well, or just falling flat, or just being completely forgettable. And that's the Xbox One's legacy at the end of the day. The worst stuff about this thing happened before it launched. And then when it launched, I mean, like, it was a perfectly serviceable console. And I think most people just kind of like used it for like, oh, you know, Call of Duty and just, you know, your third-party games at that time. But other than that, like, there just wasn't a ton going on with this thing. And it did okay overall. I think it sold roughly around 50 million units. When you compare that to what the PS4 did, all the amazing games that came out on PS4 and the excitement surrounding that platform, the Xbox One obviously really struggled to kind of maintain relevance and excitement. Now, of course, its legacy lives on with the Xbox Series X and S because, you know, fundamentally, those consoles just kind of continue the Xbox One's whole shtick. And to an extent, those platforms have even worse problems with like exclusive games and everything. But to be fair, like Microsoft's strategy has changed a lot with the jump to that generation, and Microsoft basically became like a third-party publisher. And I just don't really think the Series X and Series S really had nearly as many controversial problems as the Xbox One did. And it's very obvious where the problems with this console began. And it began with Microsoft thinking, hey, we're untouchable. We're the kings of gaming. Nothing can stop us. It turned out everything stopped them. Next up, oh man, what was PlayStation's third console called? Well, regardless, I already kind of mentioned a little bit about the PS3's initial problems during the Xbox One segment here. Honestly, Sony was kind of doing a lot of the same stuff Microsoft did with the Xbox One. It's pretty crazy how these companies never really seem to learn. They have tremendous success with one console, and then the next one, a lot of times, they get pretty arrogant and they just think they can do whatever they want. That console humbles them a bit, and then the next console, they kind of try to like, all right, we got to do something a little different here. But of course, Sony was arrogant as going into the PS3. I mean, the PS2 was the best-selling console of all time, following up the PlayStation 1, which was the best-selling console of all time. So with the PS3, it felt like Sony wanted to create the ultimate device. They were like, let's just cram as many things into this as possible. They put in the Cell processor, which could have done all kinds of things. The PS3 had like 1 billion card readers and inputs on it. You look through the user interface of the thing, and it's capable of all kinds of stuff. And graphically, it was unmatched. The PS3 looked magical. Like games looked like real life on this thing. But of course, all of this came at a cost. And of course, the big controversial moment for the PS3 was that E3 2006 press conference where they announced the price of $599 US. Now, of course, that was for the most expensive model of PS3. Sony was offering cheaper options at like, you know, $499. But that was a huge chunk of change. Now, that's a huge chunk of change these days. Think about it back in 2006. You know, for the first couple of years of the PS3, it wasn't getting like a ton of like exclusives that were like, oh my God, must-haves. You know, you had Resistance Fallen Man at the very launch of the PS3, and you know, it's decent enough. And a year later in 2007, you got Uncharted, which, you know, again, Uncharted, while it became a big deal, the first Uncharted was like, yeah, it was good, but, you know, I think Uncharted 2 really did make a huge difference. And then you had stuff like Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of Destruction, which, again, is good, but Ratchet & Clank games, you know, like, there's only so much those things can do. Like, they're always fun. They're always good. But to me, a lot of the Ratchet & Clank games, they sort of kind of blend in with each other. They're all different, but it's also like a Ratchet & Clank game is a Ratchet & Clank game. It's kind of just like, this is going to give you a good time. That's all it is. It's just like, I know I'm going to get a good game with a Ratchet & Clank game. I'd say things started to change with Metal Gear Solid 4 in 2008. But even then, I think the PS3 really started to change things up in 2009 with the redesigned PS3 Slim, because that effectively gave you a much better price point of $299. Now, the original model PS3, you know, they had multiple different SKUs to that thing at multiple price points. You know, it wasn't always just a $599 model. I think the problem is, it was always really confusing. You know, like the premium PS3s, you could actually play PS2 games on those things. But then lower end model PS3s, you couldn't play PS2 games on them. You could only play PS1 or PS3 games. Some PS3s had different card readers on them. Some of them didn't. Back in the day, like I didn't know what the hell was the difference between a lot of these different models. And eventually Sony just said, it. We're redesigning the PS3. They just stripped out PS2 backwards compatibility in general because PS2 backwards compatibility was pretty expensive to include. Like they pretty much had to include an entire PS2 in the PS3. But that slim model really helped things. Because I'd say from 2009 onwards, Sony had a consistent supply of great exclusives and just cool stuff going on from there on out. And I mean, damn good deals. For $299, the PS3 was a great Blu-ray player, and you had PS1 support, great games on the PS3. Eventually, they introduced the PlayStation Move, which, you know, but it doesn't matter. Eventually, the PS3 became a really solid option for anybody looking for a new game console. And even with some bumps in the road, like there was the infamous PlayStation Network hack in 2011, I think Sony made things pretty right. Like, they mentioned it at their E3 2011 press conference, and they gave everybody a bunch of free games. The PS3 ended up being like probably the best console from that generation easily. And it just shows that you just gotta stick with it sometimes. Even if a product isn't an immediate success at launch, a lot of times it can become one. You just gotta keep supporting it. If only Sega knew that. Jesus Christ. I mean, what do you even consider to be Sega's third console? Because, you know, we start with the Sega Master System, then the Sega Genesis, but then you have the two add-ons for the Sega Genesis, which are basically their very own consoles. You have the Sega CD, which did okay overall. The 32X, which was a massive fucking bomb. And then you have the Saturn, which did pretty good in Japan, and did absolutely just balls everywhere else. I would say it's the Saturn, but, you know, I mean, hell, you could say the 32X if you really want to, because the 32X is funny. This is genuinely one of the worst things ever. Like, there's really not much going for the 32X. It doesn't really have many great games. Like, at least with something like the Virtual Boy at least, like, has a couple of decent games, but, I mean, like, 32X, I mean, like, what? Why do you want to use the 32X? Now, the Sega CD has far better games, and there's more of a reason to actually get this, especially back in the day. But the CD was just kind of like a overly expensive add-on that was just like a little too ahead of its time. Like, the loading times were absurd on this thing. And the types of games available on it, I just kind of feel like you needed to wait another generation for that 32-bit era, you know, the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, because those utilized CDs, and I think they were just powerful enough to do a lot of the stuff that the Sega CD was trying to do, like full motion video stuff on the Sega CD. Looks like ass. And they're still trying to figure out how to utilize CD functionality properly with video games. So yeah, there's just a lot of FMV garbage on the Sega CD. But we have the Sega Saturn, which the Saturn is a good game console. The problem is Sega was fucking stupid and crazy most of the time. I believe they wanted the Sega Saturn to be more powerful, so they kind of just threw like another processor in there. I don't know. I think it was mainly because Sega assumed that the future of gaming was going to be just 2D gaming enhanced with some 3D elements in there. But then you look over at the PS1, which was doing a lot more 3D stuff, and especially when the N64 came along, like it's pretty much doing nothing but 3D stuff. I think Sega went like, oh shit. So they threw in another processor in the Sega Saturn to just do more 3D stuff. I don't know. Like, apparently this thing was a nightmare to develop for. Maybe so then the Sega Saturn is like a beast when it comes to 2D sprite-based games. Like, they look gorgeous on this thing. But 3D games, the Saturn doesn't do 3D the best, but, you know, I can still do it. But what really killed the Saturn was the fact that Sega just kind of put it out in stores. They really didn't tell anybody. They just announced, like, they were like, oh, and the Saturn is out right now. They rushed this thing to market to beat the PS1. But the PS1 ended up beating the Sega Saturn price-wise. The Saturn was famously $399. The PS1 was $299. And the fact that Sega rushed this thing to market and the launch games weren't very good, like, that pissed off developers because they couldn't finish their games properly. So you just had like shitty ports of Virtua Fighter 1 and Daytona USA. And for some ungodly reason, Sega just didn't really give a shit about making a Sonic game for the Saturn. They told Sonic Team, it's just like, oh, why don't you do something else? Make us a new Sonic, pretty much. And they made Nights into Dreams, which Nights into Dreams is a cool game. But Sonic was Sega's mascot, man. It's kind of like if Nintendo went from the NES to the Super Nintendo and they were like, we shouldn't make another Mario game. We should make something new. It's like, yes, make something new, but you should also continue the popular franchise. And, you know, they tried to, but, you know, like, it just didn't end up working out. You got Sonic Jam, which was just a compilation of Sonic games. A cool one, but still just a compilation. An enhanced port of Sonic 3D Blast. That didn't impress anybody. Like, it's a mediocre, like, okay game at best, but just not impressive when you compare Sonic 3D Blast on the Sega Saturn to Super Mario 64 or Crash Bandicoot on the PS1, and Sonic R, which is a love it or hate it racing game. They wanted to do Sonic Extreme on the Saturn, but it just was the worst development hell of all time. Like, this game went through the ringer. So yeah, I think Sega just got a little too weird with the Sega Saturn, and they gave up too soon. Sega burned a lot of people with the Sega Saturn, specifically developers. Electronic Arts was like, "Fuck you, Sega, we're not gonna develop for your shit anymore." And they refused to support the Sega Dreamcast. In the end, the Saturn did pretty good in Japan, but it just gained absolutely no traction here in North America. Which, weirdly enough, you know, the Genesis was what was really popular in North America, didn't do as well in Japan, so they kind of flipped things around there. But Sega definitely got a little too cocky and a little too crazy with the Saturn. And I think that kind of shows like what happens with a lot of these third consoles. These companies just get a little too ballsy. They think they can do no wrong, when in reality, they kind of need to be humbled a lot of the time. And I think it's kind of funny that it's always the third console. You know, we'll see if that continues with these companies because, you know, it happened with Nintendo on the 3rd, it happened with Nintendo on the 6th. When we get to the 9th, we'll see. When we get to the PlayStation 6, who knows? Maybe that'll be a massive, massive failure. But let this be a lesson to you. Don't get too big of a head because you're not as cool as you may think you are. Because you may think you're an Xbox 360, but you might be an Xbox One, and that's fucking embarrassing.